Hello, everybody. This is Craig Watson from the Pacific War Channel, where we cover the entire history of the Asia-Pacific War from 1937 all the way up to 1945, and all the major events that led up to it. Joined here yet again by my co-host, Gaurav. How are you?
Hey, Craig. Wonderful to be back again. And this time, well, we're going halfway around the world from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles and waters of Green Hell.
Yeah, we're finally back in the Pacific. I mean, for audience members that follow each of these podcasts week by week, it's going to be a little jarring. We're going from this North African campaign, and then we're kind of sprinkling in these naval battles. But this one today, it's going to be an interesting one. It's one that a lot of people don't talk about or don't know about, the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. But before we do that, I just want to, give a little shout out to my Patreon account, which is still growing, by the way. It can be found at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel. And for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast over there. You get early access to all the content I make and voting rights for what subjects I might tackle next. And at this point, we're at plus 20 exclusive Patreon podcasts. There's a lot of interesting titles over there. I did an episode on Unit 731, which was horrifying. I just did an episode that was an alternate history one on what if Japan attacked the USSR during World War II, specifically during Operation Barbarossa. And, biography pieces on like General Yamashita and stuff. There's a lot of interesting stuff over there. So I really think it's worth your while to check it out.
Just adding, that Unit 731 was, well, I mean, an interesting read, but horrifying. But yeah,
And
it's quite a enlightening. Probably that's not even sure the right term, but yeah.
And we shouldn't go down this rabbit hole, but a lot of people, especially on YouTube, have covered Unit 731. But I wanted to give something to my audience that they hadn't heard of. So I tried to touch upon all of the different units, because Unit 731 is just one of many. There was countless units found in Manchuria, China proper, even Singapore and other places. Thailand, that's a real controversial one. There probably was one in Thailand. It's been hidden under wraps for a long time. And I also talked a bit about the Operation Paperclip version of this, what happened to the Japanese scientists involved in the biological warfare, because a lot of them, they made their way to the United States. And the surprise to me, I found out they probably unleashed some biological weapons during the Korean War. So the more you know.
Yeah. But anyways, I guess, let's not go down the rabbit hole, but so.
Because this is going to be a long episode.
True. And it's quite surprising. I'm never in the Pacific War. You think about the major naval battles or like say decisive encounters, right? Even the Battle of the Bismarck Sea is better known than the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal.
Yeah,
which
for sure.
Actually is quite surprising because it was the battle on the sea that completely turned the tide of the entire campaign, right? Otherwise, it was a stalemate between the Japanese and the Americans on the island of death. And, now this one battle is really the reason that, the Americans started to gain the momentum and control the campaign. So it's quite surprising that it's not that well known.
And, before we jump right into the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, I think it would be, more than interesting if Gaurav, perhaps you could give us a bit of context as to why is there a Naval Battle of Guadalcanal? How did we get here?
All right. So, mid-1942, after Midway, the Allies wanted to strike back at Japan, right? So they realized, okay, you have only three options. Either go north through the Aleutians, but there's no strategic gain. The Central Pacific, the United States fleet was not at all strong enough yet to challenge the Japanese Navy. So you try to go through Solomons in Australia, where you're trying to curtail. You have MacArthur's Australian and American forces on New Guinea, and now you have the Marines coming in through the Solomon Islands as they try to make their way towards Rabaul for now, and which is a major Japanese stronghold. And the reason they have to go through this island hopping is obviously air bases have become a very important war asset, and these islands were littered with them. So you need obviously a staging ground. So the Japanese initially did look at adding the islands of Tulagi and Guadalcanal, but then the First Marine Division did land and they took the island by storm. Then we have the naval battle of Savo Island, which was just a couple of days or so after the Marines landed. And we have a podcast talking about that battle, but the outcome was significant. You had the carrier forces retreat. Well, I mean, they retreated before the battle, and the supplies were not fully unloaded, and quite a good chunk of the screening force was at the bottom of the ocean, the sea. So the Marines were in quite a desperate spot, and so now the Japanese actually thought that, hey, most of the Marine division has actually left. There's just probably like few hundred stragglers or a small force there. So they want to take back the island because obviously they have an incomplete airstrip. They might as well just try to, you know, make that asset of some use. I mean, it was the same equipment that the Americans used to complete Henderson Field, anyways. So you have the Ichiki detachment, which is about just under 1,000 men. They land, and then that was the first of many attacks by the Japanese on the Americans at Henderson Field. And in the Battle of the Tenaru, you know, Ichiki and most of his detachment is killed, while the Americans, they obviously hold the line with ease, you know, with I think about 40 to 45 Marines killed. Then I think the Japanese realized, oh, wait, maybe there's actually a bigger force. So they sent the Kawaguchi detachment, which is now a force of around almost 6,000 men under Major General Kawaguchi. And they land on the island safely. And they try to march and attack from the southern perimeter of the Marine defenses. Right. And he had a fairly decent chance to actually potentially knock the Marines out, because while the US forces outnumbered him, because the supplies are not enough at the moment, with sickness, they don't have as much ammunition, food, and supplies. So their combat effectiveness is, it's not on the higher side that would guarantee them a victory. But ultimately, this attack fails at the Battle of Edson's Ridge, where thanks to the leadership of Colonel Edson, more than anyone else, the Marines beat back the assault. So now the Japanese are retreating, and they're going to be transporting literally, I think, a couple of divisions now to, the island, and they'll probably be a discussion for another podcast. But that's the situation. So now we have reached a kind of 12-hour shift on the day of Guadalcanal, where both sides are trying to supply their armies on the island. So you have the US sending in supplies during the hours of daylight, where the Cactus Air Force is able to provide air cover for them. And before night, they leave because the Japanese have the superior night fighting capabilities at this time of the war. It's not even a contest, and I think the Americans have realized this as well, that it's not going to be easy for them to take out the Japanese. And at night, what is dubbed the Tokyo Express, you have Japanese destroyers, mostly commanded by, if I'm not mistaken, Rear Admiral Tanaka, who would be landing in troops and supplies via destroyer runs. And sometimes I guess they would also be, moving forward towards Henderson Field and, bombarding the US base there. But these guys the Tokyo Express would then have to retire before the hours of daylight, because the Cactus Air Force is going to try to wreak havoc amongst them otherwise. So, you have this stalemate going on, but obviously the other side wants is you need to keep them. You need to take the initiative and press the attack. So now we reach a point where Admiral Yamamoto is trying to gun for the decisive naval battle, which he's always believed is the necessity to allow Japan to prosper, because it'll, if not getting the Americans to the peace table, at least it's going to buy them a lot of time to secure their new empire. So that is what the IJN is kind of gunning for at the moment. They want to have this big decisive battle. On the other hand, the US make a big and I will call it probably a very good decision for area command. So the entire Solomon's campaign was run from the United States South Pacific area, as was an area designated by the Joint Chief of Staff, and it was placed under the command of Vice Admiral Gormley. And it was quite with hindsight, we can say it was a very uninspiring choice. So Gormley, first of all, was based at Noumea, which is like over 1,000 kilometers away, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
And
probably just
this is
about.
quite, yeah, it was about, actually, it was 1,000 miles. It's about 1,400 kilometers away. But now, this is also in stark contrast to Nimitz's orders to him, because he reports only to Nimitz. Is Nimitz wants him to be visible, like the soldier should know he's near the front, and he has to make visits there, but he never does that. He's kind of like kind of not having a great time with the French authorities on Noumea, and at the same time he's quite pessimistic. He's not at all an aggressive commander. Like, he even makes Admiral Fletcher look aggressive.
Which
I'll
is saying
just
a
leave
lot.
it there.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that was it. So, but the thing is, as the area commander, he never stepped in between disputes of his subordinates. So, for example, like Admirals Turner and Fletcher kept arguing a lot about, like, say, carrier coverage and everything. And because he never stepped in, they could freely interpret the directives that Nimitz and the Navy had for them to their own bias, which is why, Fletcher, for example, withdrew within 2-3 days of the Guadalcanal landings when the plan was for 10 days of cover. So, you're not inspiring your subordinates by this, or your soldiers. And he was just in a mountain of paperwork, because, as you had told me, right, he was quite known for over planning.
Yeah, he was the kind of guy that locked himself in his cabin and would just obsess over maps and all of any paperwork that was necessary. And I would call him if people work in an office setting, he's a perfectionist, I guess you could say. And it's to the detriment of his character. He kind of would come off as a bit indecisive because he would take so long to figure out what he wants to do. And it made him very
But
passive and more defensive. Yeah.
yeah, but unfortunately, at this time of the war, the US could not afford it. They needed that aggression. And so a lot of the reports that he would keep sending back to Naval High Command was like, I need more forces, I need more men, I need more supplies, I need more food, whatever. And, Admiral King did not really like this. So, you know, so you have Nimitz dispatching Vice Admiral Halsey to inspect the area and talk to the command staff. Now, Halsey is a very aggressive commander, and he was actually supposed to be the guy that would have led the forces at Midway, not Fletcher. That was the plan, but he had a illness that kept him out of action for several months. And it was only on Halsey's recommendations that Fletcher and Spruance took center stage at the Battle of Midway. Anyways, Halsey returns to active duty in September, and he first is sent to inspect the South Pacific Area Command, talk to the chief command staff, and his reports to Nimitz were probably less than encouraging, because you know a lot of the basic questions about the strategy and actions that the area commander would have had, he said it was just not there. Like, no one in his staff knew what they were doing, which for your command is probably really bad. And it's quite crazy. When Halsey lands, before he takes command of the forces, he actually tours the entire area, and he will be one guy that would. So, okay, let me just get back. So Nimitz, I think, had already made up his mind that he's gonna replace Gormley. So to said, like, when Halsey touched down, um, a lieutenant handed over a sealed envelope that Nimitz had prepared and said, "You're now going to take over command of the South Pacific area." Personally, he did not like it, because Gormley was his friend. They've served together for decades, but
Yeah.
ultimately this was a good and inspiring choice. because, as you'll see, right, he is not afraid. And he would be making several trips closer to the front lines, and that boosted the morale of his men because, they know that their commander's dead. And at the same time, he's there to at least, resolve disputes between his various subordinates. So, it electrifies the entire American situation. And yeah, as we'll see, how the results pan out for this.
And that brings us right back up to the kind of the beginning of this story. So, as you had mentioned, there had just been three disastrous attempts to take Henderson Field by the Imperial Japanese Army, and there had already been an incredible naval victory. Actually, we didn't even get to cover it yet, but it was at the Battle of Santa Cruz. That was the most recent one. And at this point, the Imperial Japanese Navy, they felt that they had achieved naval supremacy in the area. And they also felt that they were making up for the Army's failures in their mind. As, these two classically always got along, especially in the Solomon Islands campaign, for that matter. But on November the 8th, Admiral Yamamoto, he issued operation orders. And it was going to be an incredible feat, to be sure. But unbeknownst to him, and something that's reoccurring in the Pacific War, the American cryptanalysts, they extracted most of this information, its key components. So when Admiral Halsey returned to his headquarters at Noumea on November the 9th, his staff handed him over an outline for the forthcoming Japanese operation. The 8th Fleet was preparing to escort a large troop convoy to Guadalcanal on Z-Day. Aircraft were massing up at Buin, with the 11th Air Fleet under orders to attack on Z-Day -3. A Japanese carrier group was heading for a fueling rendezvous just due north of the equator to prepare for a strike on Z-Day -1. The only thing that the Americans did not know was there was going to be a battleship bombardment for Henderson Field. It can't be, overstated that during World War II, particularly with Britain and the Enigma machine, but the Americans too in the Pacific, the cryptanalysts and intelligence, it was an unbelievable advantage on their part. And it was
Oh yeah,
just,
you're dispelling a lot of the fog of war.
yeah, crippling to, I think the Japanese were hurt the most in this because even though the Germans, even though they were reading the enemy's mail, as they say, the Germans managed to do some of their own analysis work and intelligence, especially when it came to radio traffic. And as you see in the North African campaign, Rommel did find himself privy to some information about Allied orders and stuff, and he would use it against them. But overall, the British were definitely the kings of this, and I'd say second to them would be the Americans. And as they say in G.I. Joe, knowing is half the battle. I had to say that. Now, from truck, the combined fleet was going to launch carriers, Junyo, Zoyo, 3 escort carriers, 4 battleships, 5 heavy and 6 light cruisers, and 21 destroyers. This is a serious force to be reckoned with. That lineup excludes the 8th Fleet, by the way. On November the 10th, Coast Watchers are going to be reporting that they're seeing about the mass of 60 ships around Shortland, including at least 6 cruisers and 33 destroyers. And this is the same day cryptanalysts figured out that Z-Day was going to be November the 13th. For those who
So
don't
this
know,
is just like this is gonna be like the proof that the command needs that something big is coming up.
yeah, it's just proof that all of the information that they have is valid and they have the date of which it's going to happen. But I had mentioned the Coast Watchers, and I know some people might not be aware of what this was. It's very interesting, and they're kind of the unsung heroes, but they were military and civilian personnel who just were living or just put on multiple islands in areas like in the Solomon Islands chain. And they would, just like the name suggests, they would watch the coast to see if the enemy ships are going by. So they were an early warning system. And I mean, they honestly, they did a lot of work for the Allies. This was a huge advantage. And we're talking about, a time in which radar was a little primitive for the Americans and they weren't using it as good as they could. And they didn't have radars. They had no radar stations out in the Solomon Islands or anything. So these guys, were a must. They did a lot of work. Now, as incredible as it is that, they're reading the enemy's mail, Halsey had a lot to be worried about still. The USS Enterprise, his only carrier, was under repairs at the time and was projected to be without use of its forward elevator until at least November the 21st. So what he did have on hand was 2 battleships, 4 heavy and 4 light cruisers, and about 22 destroyers. So he is outgunned. Now Halsey, Even though you would imagine he should consider a more defensive or passive stance, he doesn't want to evade battle because he's an aggressive admiral. He sent orders to Admiral Kincaid to get the USS Enterprise underway by the morning of November the 11th and to, quote, be prepared to strike enemy targets in the Cactus area. So Halsey, hauling ass with Halsey, as they say. The air was very
Well, I mean,
tense.
if it is Gormley, you would not have the attack orders given. I mean, that's just a fact.
Exactly. So it's kind of one of those things where you're outgunned, but you do have intelligence indicating a lot of variables. It is a strong it's a strong tool. So he is able to play with this, I'd say. On the morning of November the 11th in Shortland Harbor, Admiral Tanaka was surveying the shipping. He had about 11 transports holding supplies for 30,000 men that would sustain them for about 20 days. He had nearly 32,000 artillery shells, 83 landing craft, and 7,000 soldiers. The soldiers consisted of the 1st Battalion, 229th Infantry, and the 2nd Battalion, 230th Infantry, and they answered to Major General Tsukitomo Tanabe, the 2nd Ship Group Commander. To provide them an escort, Tanaka reinforced himself with the Destroyer Squadron Number 2, now numbering about 12 vessels. They recently reorganized the combined fleet, and the 8th Fleet also lent some distant protection for the convoy in the form of Shokaku, Zoikaku, Zoyo, and the Junyo, and the Hio that had some repair work being done on it at that time. Admiral Condo's advance force mustered together 4 Congo-class battleships, 3 heavy and 3 light cruisers, and 21 destroyers. The Japanese, as usual, divided their forces. Kondo would have the heavy cruiser Atago as his flagship, alongside her sister Takeo, sailing under the main body. The Junyo was the airstriking unit with battleships Kongo, Haruna, and 4 destroyers as her screen. Heavy cruisers Ditone, light cruisers Sendai, and the destroyer Ayanami were the eastern reconnaissance unit. Now, according to Kondo's plan, the various components of the advance force would be spawning a bombardment unit on about Z-Day -1. Rear Admiral Hiroki Abe would take Battleship Division 11, the Heioi, the Kirishima, both to shell Henderson Field. And I mean, they're throwing buses at Henderson Field. This is going to be a very impressive bombardment. His screen would be Destroyer Squadron Number 10, and he'd be sweeping ahead of the unit with Destroyer Squadron Number 4. There's even more units. Admiral Mikawa, who's becoming a bit of a...
It's I would just say it's quite great insane that the previous force doesn't have as much of a destroyer screen. Like one destroyer screen for a carrier and 2 battleships
I
versus
mean,
2 for
if you were to look at it on a
1
map,
battleships.
they were more protected than the rest. But yeah, it is pretty crazy. Admiral Mikawa's 8th Fleet, they're divided into a main force consisting of 2 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers, and a support force consisting of 2 heavy, 1 light cruiser, and 4 destroyers. Rear Admiral Shoichi Nishimura, they would be taking the support force to help bombard Henderson Field on Z-Day. Now, if you had been listening to multiple podcasts I have done on some of these naval battles, you're probably getting a feeling of deja vu as far as these plans are concerned. The Japanese, again, are making a very overly complex operation with multiple moving pieces who are going to perform actions at very specific times. So it's going to be a hell of a time schedule. And whenever you do that, you leave a lot of variables on the table and are a lot of room for error. And that is kind of the name of the game with the Imperial Japanese Navy. Ask Admiral Yamamoto. Particularly, I mean, everyone likes to point at Midway, but there's other. I mean, if you look at the invasion plan for Pearl Harbor and the multiple other invasions going on simultaneously in the 2-day period, it's the time schedule is absolutely batshit insane, but it worked. But I mean, a lot could have
But
gone wrong.
that was, yeah. But the thing is, I would just say you don't want too many variables,
No, you want simplicity.
especially
Yeah.
But I guess the Japanese are quite oblivious to this, but they never even knew the Americans had started cracking their codes until after the war ended. So,
And I mean, when you look at, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole, but even the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Americans had the information. It's just they were looking at so much information traffic that when they were pick and choosing, it kind of fell through the cracks a bit. But I mean, they even just before Pearl Harbor, the cryptanalysts were breaking a lot of it. So the Japanese, yeah, unfortunately, they never figured that out. Well, not in time. On November the 12th, Admiral Turner, taking a similar page perhaps from the Japanese, he planned to run two separate but heavily escorted American groups of transports to Guadalcanal, carrying about 5,500 reinforcements, and if possible, he wanted to help, disrupt the Japanese plans. Turner dispatched Rear Admiral Norman Scott with Task Group 62.4, and this one consisted of the light cruiser Atlanta and three destroyers. They would escort three transports carrying the 1st Marine Aviation Engineer Battalion, and Turner would command also Task Group 67.1, carrying the 182nd Infantry Regiment, the 4th Marine Replacement Battalion, artillery, navy, and marine casuals, some supplies also aboard the four transports. His force consisted of 2 heavy and 2 light cruisers and 10 destroyers. Meanwhile, Admiral Halsey took command of Task Group 16, built around the USS Enterprise, and he would have 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, and 6 destroyers. There would also be, of course, 14 American submarines and 6 older S-boats to patrol the South Pacific waters to try and support the entire offensive. Admiral Yamamoto likewise had 14 I-boats for their side. Now, Scott's group, they took a route north around San Cristobal and managed to evade the enemy submarine patrols, but not through search planes. On November the 11th, his ships were attacked by some VALs, that's dive bombers, resulting in some damage to a transport, while the rest of his force continued to join Turner's larger task group for November the 12th. Earlier that day on the 12th, 6 American transports and their escorts were just off Lunga Point, being, the long task of unloading. It's going to take quite a while. Lieutenant Commander Mitse on Mount Austin reported sighting the unloading back on Rabaul, stating that he had saw about 3 battleships, 3 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and 5 transports. For those who don't know, Mount Austin is a very high vantage point on Guadalcanal. You can literally see all around from that point.
Well, I guess you also see the Japanese. Well, I guess I won't even say it's Japanese. It's like the errors with spotting from a distance because it's always a risk.
Yeah, of course. Mitsu's report reached the combined fleet HQ at around breakfast time, and Admiral Ugaki predicted the Americans would linger around to try and disrupt the Japanese efforts. But many other staff predicted the Americans would simply just pull out as soon as they could. Thus, no action was taken to move units to hit the Americans on the naval front. That was a mistake. In the air, the 11th Air Fleet launched a strike of 16 torpedo armed Bettys and 30 Zeros. The Coast Watchers, they saw this airwave, and they warned Turner to get his ships ready to defend themselves, and about 20 Wildcats and 8 P-39s scrambled to meet the enemy. At about 2 o'clock, the Japanese wave split into 2, swinging northeast and south to hit the American transports. Turner swerved his ships as hard as he could to port to offer just about a narrow stern as targets. And, for those who enjoy World of Warships, you can just imagine, when the aircraft are coming at you, you want to not present your broadside. So I'm making gestures with my hand, and this is a podcast. I'm going to stop doing that. But you want to give the smallest target possible. So you kind of face those that are coming at you with torpedoes. It's the only way to really, I guess, describe it in words. But all the torpedoes end up missing, and the American pilots, they swoop down. Turner's ships began, rapid firing 5-inch shells, anti-aircraft fire. And friendly fire actually kills, 5 men aboard the destroyer Buchanan. 1 Betty is hit.
Ouch.
Yeah, it's. That's the unfortunate thing when it comes to anti-aircraft fire.
Yeah.
It actually, friendly fire is pretty common in the Navy when it comes to that in World War II. A single Betty gets hit, and they bears down on the San Francisco, smashing into one of her 20-millimeter batteries, which is, that's a big aircraft coming in. 1 officer and 23 men are killed as the Betty caroons off of the superstructure. 45 men were also wounded, including Commander Mark Crowder and his executive officer. The entire attack, it lasted just about 8 minutes, and the American pilots claimed to have taken down about 17 bombers and 6 fighters, while the sailors, they claim about 9 bombers. In reality, which is very common in the Pacific War, but war in general, 11 Bettys and 1 Zero were shot down, at the cost of 3 Wildcats and 1 P-39. Meanwhile, recent reinforcements to the Cactus Air Force saw them grow to about 77 operational aircraft. Pretty serious stuff. 20 Wildcats, 8 P-38s, 18 P-39s, 23 Dauntlesses, and about 8 Avengers. Back over at Espirito Santo were 2 other squadrons, the 69th and the 70th of the Army Air Force, of B-26s ready with torpedoes. So, American reconnaissance planes were working overtime alongside radio intelligence to try and pinpoint the enemy positions. They had about a precise location of Abe's bombardment unit just due north of the Solomons, and destroyer squadron number 4 making its rendezvous with Abe. Later, they would detect Tanaka's convoy as it went past Shortland, confirming the Japanese objective. Turner estimated the Japanese strength to be about 2 battleships, 4 heavy and 2 light cruisers, and around 12 destroyers. He
It's
figured
not a
they
bad
would.
estimate.
Yeah, no, it's pretty spot on. So I'm just going to take a drink. Oh, sorry. I recorded a full podcast this morning that was also about 2 hours long, and my throat is in pain. But he
No.
figured they would be targeting his transports after they withdrew through the indispensable strait, or that they would bombard Henderson Field. No matter which, or no matter what they were doing, Turner knew that he had to face them alone because Task Force 16 was far south to intervene. To his credit, Turner did not forsake the protection of Henderson Field. He took about 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers to try and stop the Japanese surface forces. Very brave of them. But to his discredit, Turner also made a rather poor choice in who he gave tactical command to. He had 2 choices at the time: Norman Scott, who had been out 6 months at sea, and he had a major success in a night service engagement prior, or there was Daniel Callaghan, who had about 2 weeks at sea time, little battle experience, but he held 15 days seniority over Scott as a flag officer. He chose Callaghan, as you might
Yeah.
imagine. Yeah.
It is quite unfortunate because, as you said, at the Battle of Cape Esperance, that was the first US victory in the night against the Japanese, especially with Savo Island so fresh on their minds, it was a big thing. And Norman Scott, I think, using, because the US radar was not that great yet. It's not until like mid 1943 we start seeing good radars coming into service for the United States ships.
Yeah, it's the radar technology improves, but better yet, the people that are operating it have more of an understanding, and they're commanding
True.
officers, because a lot of these admirals, they simply had no idea what they were doing with radar, and it was
True
actually
enough.
on them. That it was kind of the failure of certain commanders, not using radar properly. But yeah.
Yeah, but ultimately in that battle, like of where Norman Scott did lead the US Navy to victory, he stopped a reinforcement convoy, and 2 enemy cruisers, like one sunk, one damaged, a couple of destroyers also sunk, prevented the reinforcements.
Yeah.
And that's why I think, obviously now with hindsight, it would likely have been a mistake, to have Callaghan just go and based just on seniority. But to be fair to Turner, that's exactly what the Japanese Navy kept doing as well. So,
It,
promoting people just based on seniority rather than
but I
their
mean, it's
actual
by the
expertise or
books.
merit.
It's by the books
Yeah,
what a Navy would do. Yeah. It's unfortunately that was
true
the
enough.
reality of it.
True
Yeah.
enough. I mean, this I guess hindsight is 2020. That's all.
Yeah. So he chose Galleon, and he would take 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers to confront Abe's 2 battleships, 1 cruiser, and 14 destroyers. Not looking good for him. Abe's bombardment unit possessed clear gun superiority. Japanese battleships could fire 14-inch shells, while the American heavy cruisers could fire 8-inch shells. Turner believed Callaghan's torpedo batteries would be the equalizer against the Japanese capital ships, but the Japanese overwhelmingly held an advantage in torpedoes, as we all know. They had about 190 of them, and these are long lances. And unlike the American Mark, 15, they work. And if anyone wants to know more
And
about that, check out
and
other podcasts.
and I think one critical thing, they have a far superior range to the American Mark 15 torpedoes right now. Like, I think more than double the range. So
It's like,
they hit, and they have a longer range. Like, what more do you need?
just imagine 2 boxers, but one of them has twice the arm length. It's a ridiculous advantage, yeah. And after securing the transports, Callaghan he reversed courses about 10 p.m. to form his battle formation, and he emulated Scott's formation at the Battle of Cape Esperance, and he made the exact same mistake Scott made at that battle. He did not place his flag on a ship with superior SG radar. He also made the mistake of placing none of the SG radar ships at the forefront in his column. So again, like I was alluding to, a lot of these commanders just simply did not understand how to use radar effectively. A lot of them didn't do what you would say is proper pickets. So they didn't put the radar ships at the forefront on smaller destroyers and such so that you can get early warning of when the enemy's coming in. They kept them too far back. Abe's bombardment unit and Takama's destroyer squadron 4 formed their battle composition, with the destroyers taking the lead. Abe issued orders for the bombardment to be at about 1:50 to about 2:30 a.m., and he sent Tanaka first to comb the waters around Lunga Point and Tulagi to see if there was American surface vessels there. At 9:45 p.m., the R Area Air Force reported to Abe that the weather over Guadalcanal was becoming so bad it would make aircraft spotting practically impossible. In view of the weather issue, Abe decided to turn back a bit, bid some time to wait, further developments. Now, while the bombardment unit lingered northeast, Destroyer Squadron Number 4 headed a bit north, slipping out of position. At 12:30 a.m. on November the 13th, Abe decided to carry out the bombardment as the weather seemed to be improving. 15 minutes later, Destroyer Squadron Number 4 was conducting a sweep of the waters around Lunga Point, but unbeknownst to Abe and Tanaka, the bad weather had resulted in both groups becoming way off course, actually. Abe's unit was actually in front of Tanaka's. At 1:25, signal lights on Cape Esperance were reported, and one of Hayway Pete's reported. That might have sounded weird, by the way. That's a battleship's float plane, which is Pete, reported seeing 10 ships off Lunga Point around sunset. Abe received quite a bunch of differing and contradictory reports, and he contemplated the possibility of encountering enemy surface vessels. But he heard no more reports from Destroyer Squadron Number 4, who he assumed that they were, ahead of him sweeping the area. Thus, at 1:30 a.m., Abe ordered the bombardment to commence, so he doesn't actually know the position of everybody right now. At the same moment, Callaghan's force, they're approaching Lunga Point, and Helena's SG radar picked up Abe at a range of about nearly 30,000 yards. However, Callaghan had to rely on TBS radio for his ships with SG radar to report to him, and the radio chatter was disrupting the reporting. A lot of communication errors. It seems Callaghan tried to place his column in such a way to cross Abe's T, but instead of crossing it, he turned it right into a collision. At about 1:42 a.m., Commander Stokes aboard the Cushing reported sighting 3 Japanese destroyers crossing ahead from port to starboard. Those said destroyers also saw the Cushing, and events began to occur rapidly that neither Abe or Callaghan were prepared for. Cushing's rudder swung to port as he prepared to fire guns and torpedoes at an enemy only 2,000 yards away. So for everybody, that is pretty insane distance. That's his point blank range.
Yeah.
And Stokes asked,
Especially for torpedoes. Yeah.
oh yeah. Stokes asked, shall I let them have a couple of fish? Fish referring to torpedoes, by the way, for those who don't know the Navy jargon. Callaghan first approved Stokes to fire torpedoes, but then at 1:45, he states, stand by to open fire. By 1:47, the column was returning course north, and these abrupt maneuvers threw the closely spaced, fast-moving American column into absolute disarray, and they did not come back into proper formation for some time. The 3 Japanese destroyers Stokes had sighted veered left, while Atlanta turned sharply to port, with San Francisco following suit. Callaghan saw this and he asked, what are you doing? And Captain Jenkins on the Atlanta replied, avoiding our own destroyers. The Cushing swung to the northern course and sighted Nagara just off her starboard bow. The American formation was now aimed directly at the Japanese formation, en route to pass between their 2 battleships, something you don't want to be beside, by the way. Callaghan now perceived the enemy formation at about 1:48 a.m., and he gave the order, odd ships fire to starboard, even ships fire to port. Which sounds like a pretty panicked order, by the way, just, reading it like that way.
Yeah, yeah, because I'm guessing it must be the ship's position in the column and formation.
Yeah, because he doesn't know.
But
His formation is kind of like scattered a little bit, so he doesn't know exactly where everyone is, so he can't make a proper order. So, I mean, it is a respectable, I guess you have to make an order like that, yeah.
Yeah, I guess,
But
this sounds
again,
childish, as you were saying.
Yeah, again, he shouldn't be in that situation. He even screwed over like his commanders from like a first blood attempt. But anyways, it's pretty insane, given that the disparity in enemy guns and the fact that many of the American ships had, trained their guns on the enemy already. but by giving the order he did, now many of them had to like switch targets. So you have to imagine they have to respect the order that was given. So even if they're point blank aiming at something, they have to change targets potentially. And again, I know I talk about it often. I play World of Warships, but if you play World of Warships, this sounds pretty crazy, I'd say. So basically, you have to imagine you have your left broadsides pointing towards the enemy, and all of your turrets are turned in that very direction to hit the enemy vessel. But now you're being told to fire on a vessel the other side of your ship. The literal turrets take quite a long time to turn. And I mean,
It's
this is nail biting. Yeah,
yeah. I mean, the thing is, I'm just thinking, because a cruiser's turret will naturally turn a little bit faster than the battleship's turret. So
of course.
thank God it wasn't the battleship because that would have taken longer to turn
Yeah.
around
Uh,
the turrets.
Opening the guns and aiming with a battleship, especially like it's like a Japanese shooting these 14-inch shells, it takes a long time. So yeah, they're lucky they're heavy cruisers, but still going to take some time. Excuse me. So Callaghan has now forced a close range brawl, the likes of which have never been seen before. I mean, this is going to be a hell of a brawl. On the other side, Abe was perplexed and uncertain of his own position. The most forward ship, the Udachi, reported the enemy was bearing towards Lunga. Abe had no idea that there was an enemy. You didn't know what they were referring to, what their strength was. Probably very surprised. A minute later, the Heiwei signaled a warning that 4 enemy cruisers were just up ahead. And to the bombardment unit, Abe signaled probable enemy ships in sight bearing 136 degrees. Now, amongst this tension, Captain Nishida of the Heiwei began arguing with his gunnery officer whether they had enough time to switch from high explosive shells to armor piercing to deal with the enemy ships. And I hate to bring up World of Warships again, but if you play World of Warships, there's a long cooldown when you change from explosive shells to piercing. And you have to
Well, I
imagine
mean, that's kind of like Nagumo's dilemma at Midway, right? Like a similar thing, changing the ammo
exactly.
time.
It's like a micro version of Nagumo's dilemma. You have to imagine they were planning to bombard a location for a long period of time. So they have actually got all these high explosive shells in line. There's human beings, loading these things into these huge caliber guns. It takes a lot of manpower. It takes a lot of time to go and rush over and get the other shells. So yeah, these small
Especially with the
details.
battleships, with the
Yeah,
battleship's main shells,
14
like
inch shells.
each one
Yeah.
will be, yeah, I think each one would be weighing at least 700-800 pounds,
Yep.
easy.
And it's these small little details you love to read about in the Navy books. I believe when I had written these notes, I think I was writing off of Ian Toll's first book, Crucible at Sea. I think that's where I got most of the information. But I was using another book, I forget the name, which probably something Guadalcanal escapes me. But aboard the flagship, lookouts reported 6 enemy cruisers in the direction of Lunga and another 7 towards Tulagi. So Abe orders his captains to shift their target to the enemy ships. At 1:45, the main body, that being battleships Heiwei, Kirishima, and their close escort, the cruiser Nagara and 6 destroyers, they turned 80 degrees to meet the enemy. Although the visibility was good enough to permit firing upon the enemy, Abe also instructed searchlights to be turned on so that the enemy could be better revealed and to try and mask their movements, of the other Japanese ships. The Heiwei and Akazuki's search lines targeted Atlanta, whose superstructure loomed over the rest. While the cones of light came, the first Japanese salvos were fired at about 1:48 a.m. All right. So you got Captain Jenkins aboard the Atlanta, and he has sighted the Nagara at around 3,000 yards. It's very close. Moments before searchlights are raining down upon his ship. Atlanta's main battery turned back to port to fire upon the searchlights coming at her from a range of about 1,600 yards. Atlanta's afterguns were targeting the Heiwei, while her forward group targeted a rear destroyer, most likely the Akatsuki. Atlanta managed to score some hits, but the Akatsuki fired torpedoes and one of them pierced Atlanta abreast of her forward engine room. Then a series of 5-inch shells and Heiwei's 6-inch shells peppered Atlanta. Fires just erupt all over her, and she is steadily drifting out of action into the water. As water is coming into her engine spaces. She is taking a lashing, and I mean, especially from a battleship's broadsides, and these are secondary guns. It's pretty rough. The opening moves drove both formations to disintegrate, and in the words of one American skipper, who was in this battle, he said it was a barroom brawl after the lights had been shot out. And like all skippers in this description, the battle was he wasn't wrong. It was extremely chaotic. There's a lot of confused engagements simultaneously happening. The best way to tell it is actually to tell it ship by ship what happened to them. Because if you try to do it in a chronological order, it's a little too chaotic because you're talking about
I mean,
multiple duels.
I'll just say this, watching on the Kings and Generals video, right, on the Guadalcanal campaign in the section,
Yeah,
it it gets into the chaos to life because you literally are seeing both forces just like intermingle, which is something you'd expect like now what in medieval battles, right?
yeah. Oh, I
Where
guess I can tell the audience. So obviously, yeah, I write for Kings and Generals. But when it comes to the YouTube episodes, that was the Pacific War series. There's another writer. He predominantly writes the YouTube episodes, and I follow up with him. Although I did write a lot of the YouTube episodes myself, but he was the predominant writer. When I write the podcasts, depending on the episode, because the episodes vary and the subject matter. Usually, I follow what he does, but for this episode, I completely just found other sources and I covered it in a completely different way because I think he tried to cover it in the chronological way it happens. And again, it's in a visual format, so you kind of there's more to play with. You're not verbally having to say everything that goes down because you get to see it. So it's more like if you saw the footnotes in that episode, his footnotes were more than the script, just to say the least. So it's a lot of like telling the animator what to show while you just kind of say, oh, these two ships are dueling. They just go off in the background. These two ships are dueling. But when it's a podcast, you can't really do that. So you have to do yeah, it's a different format to say the least. Yeah. It's a little bit of the insides of how that works. But we're going to be telling this one basically ship fate by ship fate. So at the American spear tip was the Cushing, and it targeted the Hayway, just 1,000 yards to report. Absolutely insane. This is kind of stuff you hear with like the naval battle of Leyte Gulf. Despite the temptation, Cushing's commander Parker heeded Callaghan's orders and turned Cushing's main battery to target a destroyer 2,000 yards starboard, while her 20 millimeter machine guns peppered the Hayway, which would have just done nothing. I don't know why you would bother.
I'm just trying to imagine why. I can see the merit of at least a 5 inches shell.
And it's like a freaking, a bunch of mosquitoes just attacking this giant battleship. It would have been so funny to see. But she launched torpedoes to port. Many of the Japanese gunners found Cushing's early and maimed her engineering plant. Cushing lost headway and bent around to her starboard just as the Hayway rear approached her starboard quarter. Cushing launched 6 torpedoes at the Hayway at about 1,200 yards, which is perfect distance, by the way. And her sailors believed that they had seen 3 hits. This was just an illusion. Um, this was an illusion, excuse me. However, what was not an illusion is the incredible amount of hits Cushing received. So she took about 10 major hits from both sides, silencing her guns, crippling her steering, and knocking out her power, while the enemy machine guns continued to spray her topsides, causing absolute carnage because they're actually shooting downwards. So
Yeah,
probably hitting
because the
people.
battleship, or you can't use the deck,
Yeah.
like to move out between the turrets or whatever the bulkheads are now.
Yeah. And 20 millimeter can definitely cause damage. Like if you fire into the superstructures and stuff, you could actually hurt people. After 5 minutes of respite, the Nagara and Yukikaze they pass on Cushing's starboard side, scoring another 7 more hits, as Cushing could only retaliate with her 20 millimeter machine guns. Cushing had no power, so she had no more firepower either to fight off this onslaught. And Parker soon gave the orders to abandon ships. She's just been completely battered to death. Prior to the guns going off, the Lefi had her sights on the Hayway and the Kirishima on her port bow. The destroyer pulled to stern close to the Hayway and sprayed the battleship with her 5-inch guns and machine guns, which killed Captain Masakane Suzuki, Abbey's chief of staff. It's a huge loss. She also fired torpedoes at point blank range, with all of them failing to arm before hitting the Hayway. Again, the American torpedo issue is at full front in this battle. It If the Americans had reliable torpedoes, this battle could have gone very different. Very different.
uh, easily, considering the ranges at which they would be launching.
Yeah, because they've negated the Japanese advantage to torpedoes by being so close to them.
Yeah, true. And at the same time, it takes a long time for the ship to turn, and 1,200 yards, you're not gonna get, like, especially if you're like a battleship. Like, how tight of a turn can you still make in that time?
Exactly. The Leifei sped past the Heiwei and after a brief lull ran into the Asugumo, Samedare, and Murasame. The Japanese trio battered Leifei with 5-inch shells, and then a single torpedo smashed into her stern. A larger salvo, most likely from the Kirishima, smashed into Leifei's boiler room, and alongside some other hits, her propulsion plant and steering were very badly damaged. More salvos began to take out Leifei's guns, and they caused fires to blaze all over her. Lieutenant Commander Hank was forced to abandon ship as the fires and damage were just simply out of control. And as Leafy sank, a large explosion occurred, killing countless men aboard her in the surrounding waters, including Lieutenant Commander Hank. He was killed. Callaghan's odd even order found the Sterret, who was the third ship in the column, with her guns targeting to port, so she had to shift them to starboard. She tossed 13 salvos at a target around 4,000 yards away. It was most likely the Nagara, but we have really no way of knowing some of these things because this was a very chaotic battle. Sterret took a hit to her helm control and began to struggle with her steering and engines. O'Bannon pulled abreast of her, trying to blanket the line of fire. Sterret's guns paused, but the Japanese did not, and they concentrated their fire, knocking out her SC radar, her radio antennas, and her fighting lights. Sterret let loose 4 torpedoes and countless 5-inch salvos at an enemy ship just to her port at about 2,000 yards. It's point blank range. And Sterret sailors believed that they had saw 2 torpedo hits, but these were just gun flashes. At 2:20,
Ouch.
yeah, I mean that's going to
That's
happen
the
a lot.
illusion.
Yeah.
That's the illusion.
And I mean, the things that people see in these battles, and I mean, these are very close battles. Like, you can't hear, like, you're just hearing guns going off. You're seeing muzzle flashes. You're seeing, the treads of torpedoes everywhere. Yeah, who's to say
No,
what's
I
happening?
mean, I'm not trying to criticize them. It's just like, with the hindsight, knowing the problems of the
Yeah.
United States
And
torpedoes,
they don't know.
that's why I'm like, the illusion. They don't
They
know.
have no idea. I mean, only some commanders are kind of picking up on it, but very few, and they're not talking. I mean, well, they are. The
Well,
submarine commanders are talking, but yeah,
yeah, it's like, as we said in the podcast, it's not until Lockwood comes and takes control that the submarines become a potent force. But yeah, let's just get back to the chaos at
yeah.
Guadalcanal.
At 2:20, Sterret's crew spotted a Japanese destroyer just 1,000 yards to her starboard bow. Sterret hit the destroyer with 2 torpedoes, which actually did explode. It's a rare occurrence. And they pummeled the main armament, and many observers believe that the destroyer sank almost immediately. At 2:27, Sterret received a few hits on her port quarter, disabling her 5-inch guns and causing an explosion that killed many of her crew and began to cause flooding of her magazines. With no more torpedoes, only half of her armaments operational, and a fifth of her crew as casualties, Lieutenant Commander Coward, which is a rough name to have,
Ouch.
yeah, he took the ship out of action, went east and then south. I wouldn't say he was a coward. He shot his load and he made his way out. And the Sterret had sustained 11 direct hits, some of which were from 14-inch salvos. Incredible that she walked that off. The last and the largest of the leading American destroyers was the O'Bannon. Her experience was full of desperate maneuvers to avoid collisions with the other American vessels. Some were fighting and very close to her. The initial fishtailing twists of the American column left O'Bannon swerving hard to avoid hitting the ships just ahead of her. When the enemy searchlights poured over Cushing, O'Bannon's gunner pelted the superstructures of the vessel using them. Several twists and turns were made to avoid hitting Sterret, leaving O'Bannon astern of the Leifei on a westerly course. A heavy crossfire began developing Cushing and Leifei as O'Bannon was opening fire upon the Heiwei. When Cushing and Leifei dropped out of sight, O'Bannon found herself leading the American column all of a sudden, with the Heiwei just 1,000 yards to her starboard. That must have been absolutely terrifying. All of Heiwei's batteries fired upon the O'Bannon, and with every shot, they passed overhead. At 156, the
That's
Heiwei
a
was
relief for a bit.
well, so if you're if you're a much smaller ship, you can get lucky because these
Yeah.
battleships can
True
only
enough.
fire at a certain angle, right? Like
I mean,
technically,
there's like a minimum. There's a minimum range that they need.
I hate doing this. If you play World of Warships, and I like to play destroyers, I'm an aggressive player. If you can sneak very close to a battleship, their secondaries might not even be able to hit you if you're low enough. But it's actually not something you want to do. As a destroyer, you want to hide and just throw torpedoes and spraying and praying, as they say. But enough of that. So, at 156, the Harry was actually ablaze with many fires, and the O'Bannon fired 2 torpedoes at very close range into her. O'Bannon's crew believed that they saw both hits cause explosions and burning particles fall back onto O'Bannon's deck, but this, again, was just another illusion. With all the targets to her starboard side not visible, O'Bannon reversed course to the east, sighting 5 burning and exploding vessels on her starboard corner. At 2:01, she swung hard to the left and narrowly missed the sinking bow of the Barton. O'Bannon began to help save survivors in the water before breaking off the action, and she took a course southeast to find more targets. All right. So the next in the American line was the San Francisco, who opened up with her 7 8-inch guns targeting one of the 2 destroyers to her starboard bow. This was most likely the Udachi. The target began to be ablaze with fires, drawing attention from all the other American ships that were close by, leading Captain Young to order his gunnery officers to switch his targets to the other enemy destroyer. The other target, unfortunately, ended up being the Atlanta. Happens in these chaotic battles. It seems the disabled Atlanta had drifted into the line of fire, and her 2 main batteries from the San Francisco scored hits directly into the Atlanta superstructure. Among the dead were Admiral Scott and 3 of his 4 staff officers, an egregious loss. It seems Callaghan saw this tragedy occur as he quickly ordered the flagship to cease fire, but inadvertently this order was sent as a general broadcast to the entire force. The command was... Oh yeah?
No, I mean, see, I can see this happening, in the chaos of the battles.
It's crazy.
Everyone's on heightened nerves and panicky, so you can't think rationally. It's not easy to say you can.
But this was a huge blunder, by the way. So like the command goes out to everybody in the American force, and the command is like cease firing, own ships. They from the viewpoint of all these captains, they don't know, oh, is that me? Am I shooting on a friendly right now and I just don't know it? Like most of the captains, by the way, they disobeyed the order because clearly they were firing upon Japanese, so they're not going to just stop defending themselves. But Captain Du Bois aboard the Portland, he says, "What is the dope? Did you want to cease fire?" Callaghan then replies and clarifies his order. "Given her hell, we want the big ones. Get the big ones first." San Francisco then swung hard left and opened fire upon the Hailway at a range of 2,500 yards. So both ships, they started exchanging fire, and both ships added some crossfire. The third salvo of 14-inch shells from the Hailway hit San Francisco in her bridge work, blowing the ship's navigator, Commander Ray Arson, over a bulwark down 2 decks, where he lands upon a 5-inch gun. The frantic crew, thinking that he's dead, were, quote, unceremoniously throwing him off, hurling ejected hot cases after him. So this poor guy that got thrown on top of this gun, they just like kicked him off and he's not dead, and they just keep firing, which is kind of comical.
I feel so bad that I actually find it comical because it's not, what any of these sailors, regardless of sides, are going through, with shells exploding and all.
Well, yeah, it's crazy. And more salvos hit San Francisco with her port and bridge superstructure, seeing a lot of guys killed. Then Hailway's secondary guns, they score many hits, and one of them mortally wounds Captain Young. A secondary shell exploded on a girder directly over Callaghan, killing him and all but one of the members of his staff. So, I mean, if you're tallying these numbers, like all of the American leadership is dying. This is insane. At the same time, a shell hit the auxiliary control station, killing Commander Joseph Hubbard, the executive officer, and another shell hit the stateroom, killing Commander Crowder.
Psst. Hey you ever hear me talk about some great Pacific War movie or documentary like Pearl Harbor Minute by Minute over on Netflix and feel the urge to watch it for yourself?
Uh-oh, you live in Japan, and your Netflix doesn't have it? Must suck to be you.
Sucks to be me right now.
Oh wow, season 4 of Demon Slayer is out. Oh wait, I can't watch it on Canadian Netflix, but it's over on Japan Netflix? Whatever will I do?
Oh no, no!
Being blocked from regional content? With private internet access, you too can watch Demon Slayer Season 4 by switching your IP address to Japan.
Yes! Hell yeah!
Why stop with Japan? With private internet access, you can change your IP address to over 84 different countries and every single US state, giving you access to region-restricted content all over the world.
Nice.
Many websites and services like Netflix are only accessible depending on your physical location, but private internet access helps you overcome these restrictions. Think about it, without private internet access, it's like paying for a TV series and missing out on the latest season. Shots fired, Demon Slayer on Canadian Netflix.
Is that like a personal attack or something?
Ever fear people are gonna find your Google searches?
Banzai! Banzai! Banzai!
FBI, open up!
Private internet access makes sure that those Google searches remain a buried secret, as private internet access encrypts your internet access and has a no logs policy. Think you're safe with the local coffee shop's free Wi-Fi? No, you are certainly not. Private internet access gives you more privacy features than any other software, and real-time protection from malware and trackers, giving you peace of mind knowing those Google searches remain seen by you and you alone. Private internet access has a no-log policy that they've defended in court, which means they are not storing any of your browsing data. Hey, are you like me using different devices under one household? Private internet access is available on all platforms and protects an unlimited amount of devices at the same time. I personally use private internet access to unblock movies and TV series from all across the globe, and I sleep easier writing scripts for my YouTube channel and others knowing my data is secure. Look, this is a no-brainer. Sign up with my link in the description of this video to get 83% off, plus 4 months for free, so it ends up being only around $2 per month. Signing up for private internet access is risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, and 24/7 customer support is available. So don't forget to click www.piavpn.com/the Pacific War Channel, and a big thanks to Private Internet Access for sponsoring this video.
So just if you're a commander in this battle and you're an American, you're getting shot. This is really bad. The devastating hits upon the San Francisco left only 31-year-old Lieutenant Commander Bruce McCandless, a young quartermaster, as the new captain. McCandless quickly surmised the ship was veering south, and as a result of all the chaos and the confusion, he could just basically point himself out of the battle. That's all he could think of doing. So try and keep her honor intact, at least. He doesn't want to abandon ship or sink. So the ship has been hit by over 45 shells at this point. Her armaments are silenced. Fires are everywhere. There's 500 tons of water rushing aboard. But McCandless recognizes the other ships in the column, upon seeing the flagship disengage, might also disengage. So this is kind of actually an awkward situation. So he put San Francisco back, pointing west towards the enemy, instead of what he should have done probably is just leave the battlefield. Thus, the enemy destroyers now passing over San Francisco's port side, trading blows with the port's 5-inch guns. The severe losses among San Francisco, elevating Lieutenant Commander Herbert Shonland to command now. So we're going through commanders really fast. He was the ship's damage control officer, and he was below deck, fully occupied trying to keep the cruiser afloat. So he wisely left McCandless to take charge. Surviving gunners kept intermittent exchanges with the Hayway and Kirishima until McCandless finally peeled east, skirting Guadalcanal shore. Just try and explain. I said that actually very awkwardly. Technically, there was another guy that was a senior ranking officer, and he should have took command, but realizing the chaos and McCandless was already like ordering people around, he just like allowed the guy to do it. That's what ended up happening.
Well, I mean, he was also busy fighting his battles, trying to keep the ship afloat. So
exactly, yeah. And I mean, you can't even imagine how many commanders died before these guys. These guys did not like they're probably very surprised to be in the situation that they're in the first place.
Yeah, but and I think even more surprising is, if it was just like a standard cruiser, in the sense like you do not have a flag officer on board, you would not have that many senior officers.
Yeah.
Because if you have an admiral, not only you have the ship's command structure, but he'll probably be getting at least 6, 7 more senior officers with him as his aides and everything, to help with the planning and everything. And they're also seniors. So
Yep.
usually you're like, if you're at the bottom of the rung already, you're like, okay, there's very low chance of, because if it's happening, we're probably really screwed.
Yeah. And we're not even close to being done. In the opening engagement again, the Portland opened fire upon a destroyer to her starboard side. Captain Du Bois disregarded the ceasefire order that had gone out, and he swung his ship north to continue firing upon said enemy cruiser. At 1:58, a destroyer hit the Portland aft of her starboard side. The hit jammed her rudder, locking her into a constant right circle. So Portland is now completing her first loop, which must have been pretty comical to see in the battlefield, by the way. And the Hathaway got into her line of fire. So Portland fired 4 salvos from her 4 turrets at about 4,000 yards, claiming 10 to 14 hits. Portland then withheld fire from her main battery to avoid friendly ships, as other ships were just scrambling about her in this chaos and confusion. The Helena, with her superior SG radar, already had her main battery targeting the Akatsuki when it came time to open fire. Continuously rapid fire took out Akatsuki's searchlights, but also attracted return fire, not doing too much damage, but it did stop a clock aboard Helena's upper works at about 1:48 a.m. It was a very cinematic moment, something you'd see in a movie. Helena made her way past a few vessels and came across the Amatsukaze, firing upon the San Francisco. At 2:04 a.m., the Helena opened fire with both her main and secondary guns, giving a brief pause when she crossed through San Francisco's line of fire. In the meantime, her 40mm batteries were peppering Nagara just 300 yards away. That's insane close. That's like collision close. Helena found herself passing around a flotilla of burning and exploding ships as she continued to fire upon the enemy, and then 5 salvos hit Helena, providing light damage. The action of the Juno are very hard to figure out. During the initial engagement, the Juno pulled up abreast of San Francisco's starboard side, and as Juno was passing San Francisco, she was hit by a torpedo into her port side. The hit knocked out her central fire control and disabled her steering. Juno almost collided with the Helena and perhaps fired around 25 rounds, some of which were directed at said Helena. Captain Swenson took the crippled ship out of the battle area. What I think happened was a torpedo that was meant for the San Francisco probably found its way and hit her, but it's hard to tell.
Yeah. But I mean, at this one, I'll just put it like, we've described the American cruisers in this engagement getting blown up or put out of commission. So it's like the heavy fighting force of this US task group in this battle it's been knocked out.
The rear units of the destroyers, the Barton, Aaron Ward, Fletcher, and Monson, they were all in terrible positions at the opening of the battle. Aaron Ward began firing upon the Hathaway at 7,000 yards, a destroyer firing upon a battleship. That's interesting. At about 1:55, had to back down to avoid the Udachi just ahead of her. A minute later, she saw 2 torpedoes pass underneath her and hit Barton's starboard side, causing a large explosion and sinking the ship immediately. Aaron Ward got up to about 18 knots, going north with her torpedo battery targeting the Hathaway, but she held her fire as San Francisco veered into close range within the Hathaway's area. Aaron Ward then peeled off to open fire at an enemy cruiser or possibly a destroyer. In the frenzy of fire, she attracted enemy searchlights from both sides, and the Aaron Ward fought her way out of the gauntlet of this illumination. The Aaron Ward received 9 direct hits. 3 of them were from 14-inch shells. Her director was disabled, as was her radar and her steering control. By 2:35, her power went out and she was coasting to a halt. The Barton, upon seeing the enemy searchlights come on and all the gunfire commence, she joined the brawl by firing upon any of the ships illuminating the lights with her 5-inch guns. At 1:52, she launched 5 torpedoes to port, and at about 7 minutes after, during all this combat, she narrowly avoided colliding with another vessel. A long lance hit her forward fire room, followed by another that broke her in 2, forcing her to sink rapidly, taking 60% of her crew down with her. Quite tragic. One of the torpedoes that hit...
But I think it's kind of does highlight the power of the torpedo here.
Oh yeah, big time. Especially the long lance.
Yeah.
One of the torpedoes that hit Barton had passed right under the Monson. The Monson likewise launched 5 torpedoes targeting the Hayway, but none of them would hit the mark. If you people are calculating now, the Hayway has survived a lot of torpedo hits, or attempted torpedo hits is better said.
I
Monson's
think we're at 15. Just
about
guessing.
15. Oh my
I
god.
lost count.
Yeah.
I think I lost
Monson
count actually.
Monson's guns fired upon an enemy destroyer at her port while she launched all of her remaining torpedoes at the same destroyer. As Monson's 20mm guns peppered the enemy destroyer just a quarter mile away, star shells burst ahead, prompting Lieutenant Commander McCombs to believe that he was actually firing on a friendly, so he ordered recognition lights to be turned on. This immediately attracted 2 searchlights to pour upon the Monson, and then an avalanche of shells. About 37 shells turned Monson into a burning wreck, and her crew were forced to abandon ship by 2:20. Hell of a battering. The Fletcher was the last ship in the American column, and because of her SG radar, had already been targeting the Akatsuki. Excuse me. But upon seeing the Akatsuki battered by heavy fire from other ships, Fletcher changed targets to the Inazuma. Fletcher was one of the few ships who complied with the ceasefire order, and some of her crew observed that the Barton and Monson were already sinking. Fletcher eventually continued to fire on multiple enemy targets and stalked a very large vessel that may have very well been the Helena. She fired torpedoes at said vessel, with some of her crew reporting hits, but as is typical in this battle, this was an illusion. The entire action of the Fletcher went, untouched. Now, over on the Japanese side, so we're looking at a whole different viewpoint in this story. During the thick of the battle at the offset was Destroyer Squadron number 10, and they formed the screen for the Heiwa and the Kirishima. The Nagara cruised ahead of the 2 battleships with the Yukikaze, Amatsukaze, and Terazuki over to the port, and the Destroyer Division 6 to the starboard. Nagara and Yukikaze were the ones who opened searchlights on the Atlanta and the San Francisco, and they opened fire and peeled away to hit Cushing. Commander Hara of the Amatsukaze raced down Nagara's starboard side, curving in towards the American column. Flares revealed the last 6 vessels of the American column, and the Amatsukaze launched 8 torpedoes at about 1:54 a.m. at a range of only 300 yards. Commander Hara saw 2 pillars of fire, that being the Barton, getting hit, and it vanished quite quickly afterwards. At about 2 a.m., Hara launched 4 more torpedoes at the Juno, who were engaging the Udachi at the time. Here, they thought they had seen a single hit about 2:02 a.m., and then they were set to rejoin the Heiwa, the only ship recognizable at this time, all obviously being the biggest too. En route, Amatsukaze ran into the San Francisco and fired 4 torpedoes, but none of them armed in time before they hit. The Amatsukaze began shelling San Francisco and kept her searchlights on the ship. The Helena began to fire upon the Amatsukaze, wrecking her main battery director, radio room, and knocked out her steering and armament hydraulics. Amatsukaze was on fire, turning in circles, but luckily 3 friendly destroyers came to the scene, diverting Helena's attention, and thus saving the Amatsukaze, who had suffered about 37 hits and had about 43 dead crew members. The Terazuki got into the brawl with 1 enemy cruiser and at least 6 destroyers, one of which was the Leifi. But they never used her searchlights and thus came out of the battle with little damage. The 3 destroyers of Destroyer Division 6 had pulled ahead of the Heiwa the moment the firing began. The Akatsuki was in the center with the Unazuma at her starboard and the Ikazue to her port. All 3 ships turned to port, passing in front of the American column ahead of the Atlanta, firing upon the flagship. The Akatsuki searchlight earned her gunfire from at least 5 enemy ships, beginning fires and drawing even more gunfire. The Akatsuki was battered until she sank beneath the waves with a handful of survivors captured later on. The Unazuma swung to port, taking a score of hits before being forced to withdraw, and the Ikazuki made her own turn to port while firing torpedoes. The Ikazuki received some of her hits to her forecastle gun mount and also peeled northwest to try and withdraw from the battle. So, 5 ships of the Destroyer Squadron 4 fought as 2 groups. In the action from the offset were the Udachi and the Harusame. Udachi's performance in this battle was quite remarkable, to be honest, After crossing Cushing's Bow at 1:42 a.m., the commander of the Udachi, Kiyoshi Kikawa, swung about 270 degrees to port and charged directly into the American column. At 1:55 a.m., the Udachi fired 8 torpedoes at a range of about 1,500 meters, hitting the Portland and possibly the Juneau. So actually, that probably was the torpedo that hit her. Then she passed through the confused American formation, causing further confusion and sending countless American vessels into radical maneuvers. The Udachi gave and received salvos from cruisers and destroyers at very close range. Kikawa pulled north and came across what she believed to be a friendly, but upon flashing recognition lights, she was met by shell fire, most likely from the air and ward. The Udachi sustained multiple hits, leaving her dead in the water by 2:26. The Harusame lost sight of the Udachi amid all this chaos and the gunfire, and made some twists and turns to unleash shells and release torpedoes. But not much is known of the overall performance during the battle for this one. The last Japanese vessels were Destroyer Squadron Number 4, the Yasugumo, leading Murasame and Samidare. Now, just before the gunfire commenced, Admiral Takama, excuse me, I thought I was reading that one wrong there, guided the squadron across the rear and then the port side of the battleships. The course skimmed far north to the action, saving the squadron from shell hits, but limited their opportunity to fire torpedoes. The squadron most likely were the culprits who shelled Leahy and Monson before distracting Helena, who was about to make a killing blow upon the Amatsukaze. The Murasame fired 7 torpedoes at a cruiser, claiming 3 hits at about 2:04, sinking it. Yasugumo fired salvos and torpedoes on the enemy vessels between 2:15 a.m. to 2:25. The Murasame received a hit on her boiler room and peeled out of the action. The Samedali received some shell hits, starting a small fire, but it caused little damage. The Heioi searchlights attracted gunfire from almost every American vessel, and several hits were received upon her. Massive tower foremast. I mean, as you can imagine, this is the biggest ship in the brawl, so she's going to take the lion's share of hits.
And not to mention, she, while having the biggest striking potential, she also has the biggest target.
Yep. Nearly every platform aboard her was on fire, making the Heioi stand out even more. So she's just kind of like this burning torch. None of the American guns could penetrate her main armor belt, but 85 shells punctured her light armor parts and ordinary steel structures. All of her light anti-aircraft guns were knocked out, as was her internal communication and control circuits for the main batteries. Her secondary battery directors were disabled, and in the confusion, Heioi's 6-inch guns peppered the Asigumo, Samidare, and Murasame. At 1:54 a.m., the Heioi turned to port to duel the San Francisco. Heioi suffered a critical hit from an 8-inch shell, which jammed her rudder and flooded her steering machinery compartment. Just 1,000 meters astern to the Heioi, the Kirishima fired 99 of her 14-inch guns and 313 of her secondary batteries. She hit the Cushing, Leahy, and San Francisco, devastating them. When Kirishima separated from the Heioi heading north at 1:54 a.m., a 6-inch shell nicked her. Over on the shore...
It just got a scratch.
Yeah, just a little scratch. It's like nothing. Now, over on the shore of Guadalcanal, Marines and soldiers were, along the coast watching what one Lieutenant Merlet called an awesome melee of light and sound. Another man, Private Robert Leckie, recalled this. The star shells rose, terrible and red. Giant tracers flashed across the night in orange arches. The sea seemed a sheet of polished obsidian on which the warships seemed to have been dropped and had been immobilized, centered amid concentric circles like shockwaves from around a stone dropped in. During this battle, Admiral Abe's nerves were quite shot. In the absolute chaos, all he could figure out was that enemy destroyers were passing by and basically firing upon him at rifle range, and it was true. The range in which all these ships are fighting each other is super small. It's really crazy. Machine gun tracers pelted his flagship, killing his chief of staff and a lot of his crew members. And the sounds of shells smashing his ship, definitely, I'd be unnerved too. I mean, you're getting hit from everything around you. Yeah. Although the Japanese ships certainly dished out a lot more than they received, the brawl had become so intertwined and chaotic that Abe had to abandon the bombardment mission. And I mean, reasonably, he would probably be fearing that he's hitting his own ships at some point. So you do want to get out of this. At about 2:26, Captain Hoover aboard the Helena ordered everyone by radio to set a course 92 degrees, making the end of the battle, though many ships continued just firing on whatever they were looking at. This was altogether a brutal 38-minute encounter. It left 2 American destroyers and 1 Japanese sunk. 2 American cruisers and 3 destroyers alongside 1 Japanese battleship and destroyer were disabled. Several hundred Americans and scores of Japanese clung to wreckage in the water, and neither side expected nor gave any mercy. At 3 a.m., Asuguma and the Murasame found the Udachi on fire and motionless. After inspecting her, Takama believed that she was beyond saving and ordered her to be scuttled about 3:17. However, rather than grabbing her crew, he turned his squadron north and left 2 boats with instructions for Udachi sailors to make their way to Cape Esperance, about 3 miles away. This did not sit well with the commander of Destroyer Division Number 2, who sent the Samidari to pick up Udachi's crew because it was a dick move on that guy's part. Like, there's no way else
I
to
mean,
put
that's
it.
not. I mean, it's one thing if it's like, your enemy. I mean, it's still a dick move, but
Yeah,
I can see the logic. But yeah, it's your own man. Like,
it's just.
man.
I remember reading that. This definitely that when I wrote these notes. This one's from Ian Toll's book. By the way, for those who have read his trilogy, it's very fantastical, and there's so much, as I would say, flavor to it. But the one thing that I've noticed after reading countless books and military manuals, Ian Toll really likes to put in, I'll call it, extra details that no one could know. And yeah, I just want to. He kind of over dramatizes stuff, so these kinds of things you have to take with a grain of salt. Anyways, at about 4 a.m., 207 men were saved by the Samidare, who fired a torpedo to scuttle the Udachi. But she didn't sink. At about 3, Kirishima sent a report of the battle stating both sides had suffered considerable damage and that the bombardment had to be cancelled. At 3:44 a.m., Admiral Yamamoto postponed the landing of the 14th, to the 14th, and he ordered Tanaka to turn the convoy back to Shortland. So after all is said and done, you always have to remember, what was the objective of the Japanese here? Convoy is not making its way. The poor Hayway was a fiery nightmare. Her rudder was jammed full right while flooding, preventing men from getting to any of the compartments to repair it. Younger officers urged Captain Masao Nishida to beach the Hayway and shell Henderson Field while the crew could, come ashore to join the ground assault forces on Guadalcanal. Although this would have been quite a badass and heroic idea, the Hayway was a Congo-class battleship and by far one of the most valuable warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Therefore, he tried everything to save her, which is exactly what an admiral should do, by the way. As first light came between Savo and Guadalcanal, fragments of the forces on both sides could be seen now. To the southeast, the Cushing, Monson, and Udachi were listing beneath columns of smoke. Just off Lunga Point, the Portland circled, and south of her was a shattered Atlanta. North of Savo was Hayway with a bunch of fellow warships trying to put out all of her fires. But at 6:30 a.m., Hayway identified an enemy vessel about 14.5 miles away and opened fire upon her. It was the immobilized Aaron Ward. But before the Hayway could sink more shells into her, aircraft began to arrive, distracting Hayway, while a tugboat took Aaron Ward to Tulagi Harbor. So Aaron Ward got very, very lucky. Yeah.
True.
And Portland saw the Udachi and, like the Hayway, opened fire from about nearly 13,000 yards away, managing to land a few shells, blowing up a magazine, sending the ship to the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. And that's actually where it gets its name, by the way. The same tugboat that saved Aaron Ward came back for the Atlanta, as Portland managed to crawl to Tulagi, just going about 3 knots. Atlanta listed and was on fire, having sustained nearly 50 hits. Captain Jenkins was unscathed, and other survivors were using buckets of water to try and combat the fires. So you got to imagine how fun that must have been.
Not really, but
yeah, when the tugboats arrived, smaller boats came to, get all the wounded off of Atlanta. tugboat's crew saw heads popping up in the waves and began to open fire with machine guns until Captain Jenkins begged them to stop, as they were Americans out there with the Japanese struggling in the water. So yeah, this battle was so chaotic that the people in the water with the wreckage were intermingling, Japanese and Americans. So that's a very interesting situation. And Atlanta was deemed unsavable and would sink by 10:15 p.m., just 3 miles west of Lunga Point. About 1,400 seamen from Callaghan's task force would come ashore at Lunga Point. The Cactus Air Force launched to action about 6:15 a.m. to try and hunt down the Hailway. 5 Dauntless and 4 Avengers attacked the battleship, claiming 1 bomb and 1 torpedo hit. 7 more Dauntless dived upon her at about 8:30 to no success, followed by a second attack at 10:10 a.m. by 4 Avengers, claiming another hit. At 10:15, 9 Avengers of the USS Enterprise with 6 Wildcats attacked Hailway, believing to have scored 3 additional hits. At 11:10, 14 B-17s dropped about 56 500-pound bombs over Hailway, claiming a single hit, because high-altitude bombing is like nearly
Very
impossible.
inaccurate.
Yeah. Then at 11:20, 6 more Dauntless attacked Hailway, reporting multiple bomb hits. And there's still more attacks. At 12:20, 6 Avengers perhaps landed a hit in Hailway, followed by another failed attack at 1:34. By this point, about 70 aircraft had tried to take her down. The Juno sent 23 Zeros and the 11th Air Fleet sent 12 more to try and defend this poor battleship, which tangled with the Wildcats, resulting in 3 Zeros being lost. But during the entire barrage, Nishida reported 3 bomb hits and 4 torpedo hits. The Hailway was completely mutilated. Her crew was brutalized. By 8:15, Abe had transferred to the Yukikaze, and he ordered the Hailway to be towed to Shortland with Kirishima that very night. As the aerial attacks mounted up throughout the day, Abe decided the Hailway could not be saved, and he ordered to be beached at Guadalcanal at about 10:20. But this was impossible. At 12:35, the crew was taken off the ship, but Nishida pleaded with Abe that the ship could still be saved. At 3:30, the Hailway was visibly listing, and Abe knew the jig was up. So the order to scuttle it was given, and Nishida challenged the command, but by this point, Abe was putting his foot down, and over 300 men would die aboard her, and she would finally sink at that very night. The morning after yes?
I was just gonna add, this was the battle that pretty much cost Admiral Abe his job. Because,
Yes.
ultimately because turning back, even though the Kirishima was still pretty much intact, if he had, Yamamoto felt like, oh yeah, this guy did not aggressively attack, he's not good. And pretty much he was, relieved of command, basically did nothing for the next 5 months. And he was forced to retire from the Japanese Navy in a few months' time.
Yeah. The morning after. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, considering doing this to a vice admiral before the retirement age and everything, it's quite a big disgrace, at least heaped upon him. I'll just say that.
Yeah. The morning after the battle, Captain Hoover of the Helena, he took command of a small task force moving south for Espirito Santo. Although the task group was zigzagging, Juno's damage limited her speed to about 18 knots, and at 11 a.m., the I-26 actually found them and fired torpedoes at the San Francisco. The torpedoes missed the San Francisco, but what hit Juno, and Lieutenant Commander McCandless recalled, the Juno didn't sink, she simply blew up with all of the fury of an erupting volcano. There was a terrific thunderclap and a plume of white water that was blotted out by a huge brown hemisphere of 1,000 yards across, from within which came the sounds of more explosions. When the dark cloud lifted from the water a minute or so later, we could see nothing of this fine 6,000-ton cruiser or the 700 men she carried. It seemed unlikely anybody survived, but naval tradition and just the pure humanity dictated Hoover should, go over to try and rescue anybody, unlike our other Japanese commander who left his buddies to die. However, Hoover faced a horrible decision. The San Francisco was also quite damaged. Helena was too critical, to lose. and leaving one or both destroyers to pick up some men would endanger the other ships and the crew. So Hoover could not stop. He signaled some B-17s passing by requesting a rescue effort, though the message never got to anybody. Halsey learnt of the Juneau's fate the next day, and upon request from Admiral Turner, Fitch and Calhoun relieved her, excuse me. Fitch and Calhoun would relieve Hoover for failing to report the Juneau sinking, and years later, Halsey would publicly state it was a mistake and an injustice to relieve Hoover, for his decision was actually a difficult one. The guy was put in a terrible, it was a terrible decision, but
It's damned if you do, damned if you don't types. Like every risk was, I mean, every choice had immense amount of risk.
Yeah.
And
but he arguably made the right decision because he had to save. You can't sacrifice the majority for the minority, as they say. But 100 to 120 men had hobbed up from the oil-filled water of the Juneau. The survivors they got together. They collected 3 rafts and 7 life nets, and San Cristobal was visible from the distance they were. And all the able-bodied men, they just rowed to it in their little flotilla. They faced days of blazing sun with exposed skin. They ran out of food in 3 days and only had rain to drink. Many expired, and the flotilla attracted many sharks. We're talking kind of like a mini Indianapolis disaster here. The sharks the sharks went first after the men trying to swim out to the shore, and thus they were more isolated. But soon the sharks got more emboldened, and they went after the men near the rafts. Signalman Lester Zook had this to say about a man he saw who had been bitten in the shoulder, leaving his arm hanging by a thread. He looked at his shipmates there and realized he was making them nauseated, that he was driving them crazy by just being there. And the sharks were getting aroused closer in the water because of the blood being there, and knowing he pushed himself off the life nets and swam out 5 or 6 feet and let the sharks have him rather than lay there and die like a coward to jeopardize the lives of his shipmates. Horrifying way to die, and tragic that he just sacrificed himself because he's like, yeah, I'm attracting the sharks to my buddies. Rough. That was a rough way to go. The ultimate survivors separated into 4 groups. The first group made a 7-day voyage to the island with 3 survivors in total. The second initially numbered 12, and they saw a single man survive who had held on to a friend whose legs were bitten off by sharks. Goddamn. The third and fourth group of originally 27 men got separated, and only 6 would be saved after 10 days at sea. The Juneau had around 10 survivors, while 683 men had perished. Atlanta lost 170, the Barton 165, Monson 145, the San Francisco 86, Cushing 72, the Laffey 57, the Sterrett 29, Portland 16, the Aaron Ward 15, and there was a single death on Helena. About 1,439 Americans died, including 5 Sullivan brothers. Yeah, and 2 admirals. The Japanese had about 255 men die, about 255 men went missing, with 297 die. And that was the battle. It was the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. I guess we could go a bit more.
That's just that was the first night's encounter, I should add.
Yeah, that's true. That's the first night. Early on November the 13th, both Halsey and Yamamoto knew that Abe had been deflected, and he moved swiftly to improvise new plans. Yamamoto rested upon Z-Day being the 14th, and he ordered Kirishima to sweep the Lunga area and to try and shell Henderson Field that very night. Most of Abe's warships were too damaged to join Kirishima. Admiral Condo decided to send the Atago and the Takeo to try and help the Kirishima as escorts, while the rest of the advance force would station themselves north of Guadalcanal to try and pounce on the enemy. At this point, Halsey got Enterprise ready to use her 78 planes alongside battleships Washington and South Dakota to try and help the Cactus Air Force. Halsey ordered Admiral Kincaid to form a separate task force composed of the 2 battleships and 4 destroyers, designated now Task Force 64, to try and go over to Iron Bottom Sound to block the Japanese efforts to bombard Henderson Field. Task Force 16 was about 360 miles south of Savo Island, and the task force would be unable to reach the area until about 8 a.m. the next morning, leaving a clear window for the bombardment of Henderson Field. So, now we have the legendary figure Admiral Mikawa, He's taking his 8th Fleet out on November the 13th, suffering a hit from one of MacArthur's B-17s, which critically damaged the Michishio. Mikawa led the main body and the support force on November the 14th, with the support force detached northwest of Savo to bombard Henderson Field. At 1:30 a.m., float planes dropped flares as the 2 heavy cruisers, Suzuya and Maya, fired about nearly 1,000 8-inch shells at Henderson Field. Nishimura, leading the support force, concluded despite the chain of explosions, the airfield was probably still usable, and he was very correct about that. They had not even hit the right airfield. They actually shelled Fighter 1, taking out about 2 Wildcats and 1 Dauntless. Mikawa and Nishimura rendezvoused at about 7:50 a.m. south of New Georgia, where they were attacked by American aircraft. It was 5 Dauntless, 3 Avengers, and 8 Wildcats that found them at 8:30, but they failed to do much damage. Now, during the night, Task Force 16 was about 200 miles southwest of Guadalcanal, sending out search planes, which soon reported that 140 miles out, 10 unidentified were coming towards the task force. This led Admiral Kincaid to launch a strike of 17 Dauntless and 10 Wildcats to hunt north. Scouts eventually found Mikawa's cruisers and destroyers south of New Georgia at 8:15 a.m., and at 9:30, the Dauntless scouts dive-bombed the Kinugasa, landing a hit in front of her bridge, killing Captain Sawa. Another set on Enterprise scouts found Mikawa leading to another hit, this time on Maya's main mast, igniting a magazine and killing 37 of her crew. Based on these scout reports, the strike force found Mikawa at 8:40 a.m., and the Dauntless dive-bombed Chokai and Izuyu, hitting her boiler rooms and causing Izuyu to lose steering control. The Kunigasa was hit again, causing flooding, which capsized her by 11:22, taking 511 of her crew down with her. Tanaka's 23 ship... Yeah, that was a hell of a loss.
That's heavy.
Yeah. Tanaka's 23 ship convoy was sailing for its second time, and when they got close to New Georgia, they received word of these attacks on Mikawa's fleet. At about 8:50 a.m., Enterprise scouts found Tanaka's convoy, and at 9:08, they attacked them. They did not hit any of the shipping, but Enterprise's strike group was still close by. By 12:50, 18 Dauntless and 7 Avengers showed up, whose pilots would claim that they made about 12 bombs and 2 torpedo hits. The Nagatomaru was hit by a torpedo, the Saidomaru and Canberra-maru were maimed by bombs. A third strike came from Guadalcanal, finding the convoy at about 2:30, sinking the Brisbane-maru. They were joined by 7 B-17s that dropped bombs at about 3 a.m., but missed. Again, high-altitude bombing out in the ocean just never works. A fourth major attack came from the USS Enterprise at about 1:05. It was 8 Dauntless and 10 Wildcats. And this group, they crippled the Shinano-maru and the Arizona-maru, who would need to be abandoned. The last 3 strikes of the day by the Cactus Air Force and Enterprise would hit the remaining transports, sinking the Nakomaru. Now, the 11th Air
This
Fleet...
is actually
this is turning the entire battle around. Yeah.
Yeah, because this is I think this convoy was supposed to have a lot of soldiers and supplies. So
this is good. We're going to go through the numbers. Yeah, it's going to be bad. So we start this episode and this whole naval battle that happens that encompasses this is so tragic and so many Americans lost the surface engagement. But again, the rationale was they were supposed to be escorting these transports, which were valuable. And as we're seeing, the air forces are just completely obliterating them. The 11th Air Fleet and the R Area Air Force, they tossed about 45 zeros to try and fight off the enemy, and they lose about 13 in the process, and they take down about 5 Dauntless. Only the darkness of night actually saves the convoy from further torment, as Tanaka's convoy now fends off, 7 hours of attacks at this point. Of Tanaka's 23 ships, 6 transports were sunk, another was escorted back for repairs, 450 men had been lost, and Tanaka did not know if he should continue or not. At 6:15, Yamamoto ordered him to keep going to Guadalcanal, using his remaining 4 transports. But during the day, Japanese search planes had also discovered an American surface fleet of 6 vessels sailing towards Guadalcanal. So, by 8:25, the American force was just about 100 miles south of Guadalcanal, and it seemed to be heading towards Tanaka. Tanaka moved his convoy to get behind the incoming Condo force for protection. Condo had been steaming south... Oh, yeah?
No, I was saying that's probably the smartest move he could do in that situation
Yeah,
because either option was lose your job by retreating and preserving your forces or get blown up.
exactly. And Condo, he had been steaming south since 5:30 with a reduced strength now of one battleship, two heavy and two light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. Kondo split up his forces, sending a sweeping unit led by Rear Admiral Hashimoto, consisting of one light cruiser and 3 destroyers, while Kondo would direct the bombardment unit of Atago, Takeo, and Kirishima, and Rear Admiral Kimura would lead a screening unit. Kondo expected a clash with a few American cruisers and destroyers, and by 7, he told Tanaka he would clear a path for him by eliminating any seaborne opposition near Lunga Point. Admiral Willis Lee was leading the American ships north on November the 14th when he received intelligence that the enemy bombardment group and convoy might have a strength of 3 battleships, 8 to 10 cruisers, a dozen destroyers, and 9 transports. It's a hell of a lot of surface ships. Halsey had given Lee freedom of action, so as soon as he reached Guadalcanal, and Lee determined to take an excursion east of Savo to see if he could confront the bombardment group and later the convoy group. Very bold, very aggressive. Lee placed his 2 battleships and 4 destroyers in a single column, but made his flagship one with SG radar, as he did understand full well its valuable capabilities. So we have a rare commander here. Now,
Yeah,
Lee's,
actually, so
yeah.
like I'll just add this, like quoting one historian, Richard Frank, right? He said, you know, he knew more about radar than many of the operators itself. Like he says, so like, quoting the historian, right? To Willis Lee went many accolades. Audacious planning and execution marked his operations, commented Halsey. Unlike Callaghan, Lee never allowed action to degenerate into a nautical brawl because he formulated a workable plan and adhered to it, even after every ship in his task force except Washington was sunk or forced to retire. Lee was never more incisive than his own evaluation of his success. We realize then it should not be forgotten now that our entire superiority was almost due to the entirely possession of our radar. Certainly, we have no edge on the Japs in experience, skill, training, and performance of personnel. Like, I quite respect that he's quite blunt about the current situation because the radar is the only hope the Americans have in engaging the Japanese in night combat.
Yeah, definitely.
At this point.
And actually, you mentioned Richard Frank, so that was the other book that I've been using in these notes. I just realized that book was titled, I think, just simply Guadalcanal or Guadalcanal something in the battle.
It's called, I think, Guadalcanal, the definitive account of the landmark battle.
Yes. Yeah, it's actually one of the better books, and it's a little bit older. Yeah. So Lee, certainly he had less guns, of course. But he did have more heavier ones. Both American battleships outclassed the Kirishima. Each American battleship held 16-inch guns and had much more armor than the Kirishima, able to practically be immune to her 4-inch shells. So there is a little bit of an advantage here.
Oh, I think you should just point out that, the Congo class battleship that Admiral Congo is going to be using, right? They were built during World War One.
Yeah.
Whereas Admiral Lee's, his 2 battleships, which are the Washington and the South Dakota, both are like, the Washington's the North Carolina class and the South Dakota's from the South Dakota class, which were practically, I think, very similar. That I don't know why there's a distinction, but they were basically built in response to the developments of the Axis breaching the Washington Naval Treaty. So, they still wanted to have bigger hitting ships, but still kind of keeping closer to the regulations. So these were the answers of better armored, better powered ships. And they also had a speed advantage.
Yeah.
Because, these ships were able to put out a top speed of, 52 kilometers an hour.
That's pretty fast.
Which, was slightly faster than the Kirishima, but you also have more guns and armor, so the same.
Oh, but the Japanese do have one advantage. They got the edge in torpedoes, and that is something that can kill battleships. That's for sure. Multiple hits could sink Washington or the South Dakota. And Condo, he's got about 90 torpedoes. So we'll see how this goes. Some of Lee's sailors saw the glow of fires at night, which were Tanaka's burning transports just about 21 miles northwest of Savo. At 9:48, Lee's force was about 12 miles north of Savo, and he began heading southeast as Kondo was splitting his force into 3 units. Admiral Hashimoto prepared his sweeping unit, peeled off, and he almost immediately saw the Shinikame begin. The men aboard the Shinikame began to see distant silhouettes of enemy ships. Hashimoto took his force clockwise around Savo to try and get behind the enemy while detaching Ayanami to conduct an independent counterclockwise sweep just in case. By 10:31, Kondo received reports of the enemy Hashimoto was hunting, but then he got reports of more ship silhouettes in a westerly direction. By 11, Kondo was receiving a ton of reports, confusing the hell out of him, but he assumed this westerly enemy had to be Tanaka. But just in case, Kondo decided to take his force to help Hashimoto deal with the incoming enemy before commencing the bombardment of Henderson Field. By 11:15, his force was passing north of Savo, and he ordered Hashimoto and Kimura's screening force to follow the enemy to the eastern side of Savo, where they would engage them all. Washington's SG radar picked up Hashimoto's unit at about 10:52 at a range of 9 miles. She tracked the unit until 11:12, when the main battery director acquired them visually. South Dakota likewise had them in sight, but none of the destroyers did. At 11:16, Lee granted the order to open fire when ready, and a minute later, Washington fired from nearly 20,000 yards her first salvo, with her 5-inch guns fired star shells over the Japanese column simultaneously. South Dakota fired 16-inch shells a minute after Washington, and Hashimoto quickly ordered smoke to be laid down for the unit to wheel around, and then he believed he was facing cruisers and not battleships, so that's kind of a crucial mistake he makes at the beginning of this. At 11:22, the battleships checked their fire as the destroyers closed in on the enemy. The Walk and Benham targeted Ayanami, who was much more isolated than the other ships. Preston's lookouts then suddenly saw Kimura's screening unit enter the scene, sounding the alarm to the new threat at 11:27. Walk and Gwyn soon shifted targets to Kimura's ships, which were attempting to aid the 2 battleships by firing illumination rounds. Kimura identified his enemy to be 3 destroyers and a cruiser. Nagara's 5.5-inch guns and 5-inch guns of the destroyers around her began to batter the Americans. Lee's destroyers stood much more exposed in the open water, while Kimura had Savo behind them, making it much more difficult to target. So, try and explain this. If you're looking at an open ocean, you can see ship silhouettes a lot easier. But if there is an island or some kind of like coastal structure behind the enemy, it kind of almost blends it in. You can't see the ship silhouettes as easily, so the gunnery officers can't easily target them. Also, the Japanese enjoyed, as usual, an advantage, with their long lance torpedoes. Ayanami launched a few at 11:30, and 5 minutes later, Kimura ordered all of the ships to do the same. Before the torpedoes even came close to the Americans, the Preston was being shelled heavily by Nagara. She received a hit toppling her second stack, which collapsed onto her starboard torpedo tubes, ripping a number of the torpedoes and igniting them. More hits to her engine room, and gun mounts began turning her into basically an inferno. Shells killed almost all of the crew from the auxiliary con aft, including her executive officer. Preston's steering jammed, and only her forward guns could bear on the enemy. By 11:36, Commander Storms ordered the abandoned ship, and less than a minute after, Preston began to roll over, hung with her bow in the air for about 10 minutes before sinking. Storms and 117 of the crew would survive. Now, the Gwyn, only 300 yards astern of Preston, witnessed the devastation at 11:32 as 2 shell hits her engine room. Another shell ricocheted over her stern, splitting open 2 depth charges. The Walk was also being battered by a lot of hits, and then 1 long lance smashed into her forward bridge, detonating 2 of her magazines. The explosions lifted the entire ship and shoved her hard to port. Her bow snapped right off. She lost power, and communications and fires began all over her. With ammunition ignited and exploding all over, Commander Fraser ordered abandoned ship. As 4 rafts got into the water and the Walk sank, depth charges began to explode aboard her, killing men in the water, bringing the death toll to about 80, including Commander Fraser. The Benham was also hit by a long lance at the extremity, and it went right into her bow. The explosion did not cause fatalities, but it tore a chunk from her lower bow, causing Benham to make a loop to try and escape the gunfire. Kimura's ships managed all of this with very little damage, but the Ayanami would end up paying for her service. Ayanami pressed 2 miles within the American column, and when she opened fire, her gun flashes basically gave her away to the USS Washington. And Washington, to a less extent, the South Dakota, they both fired upon her. And Ayanami's engineering plant caused her to lose power and leaving her a burning pyre dead in the water. So she got really battered. With the two survivors.
Well, I mean, it's not going to be easy when two battleships decide to target you.
Yeah, it's true and especially when you're a smaller ship. With the two survivors, the Benham and the Gwyn, now crippled and hobbling around, at 11:48, Lee ordered them to retire. Meanwhile, Admiral Condo, he ordered the bombardment unit at 11:39 to continue west to hunt for these possible enemies. As the bombardment unit turned to course at 11:50, Takeo reported the enemy competition as 1 battleship and 3 destroyers. Lookouts on the Atago also claimed to see what looked like a battleship. Nonetheless, Kondo discounted the possibility he was facing any capital ships. They had to be cruisers in his mind, which he wouldn't be wrong about because it would be unusual to find an American battleship out here. So a huge risk to have a capital ship come out.
Especially in confined waters.
Oh yeah.
You usually want to keep ships in especially at the carriers and your battleships in the open waters where they're protected and can maneuver better.
Yeah. Kondo was also receiving word from Ayanami at 11:50 that the battle had evolved so auspiciously that his best move was to simply go ahead and shell Henderson Field like he's supposed to. So at 11:54, he changed course 130 degrees towards Lunga Point. As he swung the bombardment unit towards Henderson Field, Hashimoto detached Yonami to help the ailing Ayanami, with Sendai and Shikinami going over to Lunga Point. At 11:57, Nagara reported seeing 2 enemy battleships just due north of Cape Esperance, but Kondo brushed this off as completely ridiculous. Washington's SG radar picked up the bombardment unit, and they tracked them. South Dakota followed suit, and the 2 battleships closed in on Kondo, just 3 miles away at this point. Uh-oh. So Kondo's own lookouts saw the South Dakota and labeled her a heavy cruiser. Then at midnight, the Japanese lookouts began shouting that, oh shit, it's a battleship. Lee's battleships were about 11 miles west of Savo, just before they presented their broadsides, and the bombardment unit fired torpedoes targeting the South Dakota at very short range. Then at midnight, Atago opened her searchlights upon South Dakota, which finally proved to Kondo it was in fact a battleship. The gunners from all 5 Japanese warships poured salvos upon the South Dakota, from 3.9-inch to 14-inch shells. At about 12:02, the Yasugumo tossed some long lances, adding to the list of torpedoes already heading towards the South Dakota. Many of the torpedoes prematurely exploded, making the Japanese think that they had scored multiple hits, but no torpedoes actually hit the battleship. In the span of 4 minutes, the South Dakota... Oh, yeah?
I would just say for the South Dakota, that's a lucky break.
Oh, it's a huge lucky break, yeah. And in the span of just 4 minutes, the South Dakota received 27 shell hits, and her armor defeated all of them, even the 14-inch shells. So she's a very formidable turtle in this case. South Dakota superstructures, however, did take a beating. Most of the shells did not even explode, and no major damage came about, though. While the punishment did not threaten her survival, in the words of Lee, the firing rendered one of our new battleships deaf, dumb, blind, and impotent. That's because South Dakota's radios were knocked out, her radar was damaged, and her gun directors were disabled. Her main battery only got off about 5 salvos. The attack on the South Dakota preoccupied the bombardment unit so much that they completely overlooked the presence of the USS Washington. Now, Washington fired 1 pair of her twin 5-inch guns upon the Atago. Another battery fired illumination rounds, and 9 barrels of the main battery targeted the Kirishima at a range of about 8,400 yards. The Japanese battleship was smashed by 9 16-inch shells, and around 45-inch shells. Her 2 battery turrets were disabled, her rudder was jammed, and she had multiple holes below the waterline. Flooding caused Kirishima to be pulled to her starboard side, and she began to make a circle to port. Kondo ordered the unit to pull to port, but Kirishima, lacking rudder control, became separated from the rest. Kondo could see Tanaka's convoy was off his starboard bow and adjusted the bombardment unit to change course to defend it. When the Japanese abruptly stopped firing upon South Dakota, their fire teams went quickly to work putting out the countless fires the Japanese shelling had caused. 30 men lay dead and 50 wounded because of the shrapnel and fires, and Captain Gatch perceived the ship was more of a liability now, so he asked to retire. As Kondo's unit was changing its course, it could see the South Dakota moving 6 miles away, and Kondo began to wheel the ships to starboard to try and fire some more long lances. It was just then that Kondo's lookouts reported a second battleship was beyond the first. So at 12:13, Atago and Takeo each fired 8 long lances towards the USS Washington at about 4,000 yards. It's not much of a distance for the long lances, and they're very fast, so chances of getting away very limited. Kondo swung the bombardment unit 300 degrees to fire broadsides upon the 2 battleships, and ordered the convoy to turn away from the heated area of battle. 4 minutes later, the Japanese thought their torpedoes had hit one of the battleships. Now, during this entire escapade, Lee had gone into action with 6 ships, but 4 of his destroyers got, completely destroyed by Kimura. However, between the 4 destroyers' actions with Kimura and his 2 battleships, they had thwarted the bombardment thus far of Henderson Field. Now, Lee only had the USS Washington basically available, and she was fast, armored, powerful, and undamaged thus far. At 12:20, he ordered Washington to continue the action, and she made her way dodging the torpedoes that had been sent against her. Kondo, meanwhile, was stripped off Kirishima, but held significant torpedoes-wielding vessels. Oh, sorry. Something in my mouth there. Sorry.
No worries.
Kondo was he was stripped of the Kirishima, so he's lost a lot of his firepower. But he orders Kimura to perform a pursuit course, and Hashimoto's screen unit was lagging well astern to Kondo and Lee as he was struggling to reload his torpedo tubes, because they had just kind of unloaded all the torpedoes that they had. Tanaka, on his own initiative, decided to detach Oyashio and Kagero to help attack the Americans while he kept 4 destroyers to protect his convoy. So even Tanaka is trying to throw ships into this battle. It's really chaotic. Washington converged on the bombardment unit as Kondo was reiterating to all of his units to converge and hit that battleship. Torpedo tubes were reloaded by 12:30, and Kimura began to pursue Washington. Lee saw the Kagero and Oshio entering the battlefield, and he deployed smoke, so he and Captain Davis turned Washington hard to starboard to try and avoid running into torpedoes at close range. You have to imagine, this is terrifying. For a battleship basically on its own, surrounded by all these ships that can fire torpedoes. I mean, this is a fast battleship, but it's not fast enough to
No, they don't outclass destroyers.
Exactly.
In speed.
This is honestly a little bit suicidal. Washington made a southern retirement course, and Lee deduced he had delayed the convoy so long that by the time they even reached Guadalcanal, it would be daylight. Thus, this would allow the Cactus Air Force a great opportunity to just smash and unload them. So, by just kind of wasting the enemy's time here, he kind of won a tactical victory. Kondo saw Washington's course change, and by 12:32, he ordered the bombardment to be canceled. The Oshio, meanwhile, fired torpedoes at the fleeing battleship, followed by the Samedare. Despite the long range, many of the torpedoes came pretty close to hitting the Washington, but none did. Again, very lucky, very lucky battleship. By 12:45, Kondo lost sight of the Washington, and he detached Asugumo and Turazuki to try and chase her down. Kondo at this point deduced that Tanaka's convoy was safe and no longer required his unit for protection, so he retired, and he lingered in the area just a little bit, in case there was a carrier attacks or anything. But by 1:04, all of Kondo's ships began the retirement, except for the Kirishima, who was not responding to any messages. Asugumo, Turazuki, and the Samedare would find Kirishima at 1:43 a.m., 5 miles west of Savo, in quite some distress. Kirishima was flooding dangerously, and her counter-flooding efforts were failing. She was beginning to roll over. This is a big ship, by the way. You don't want to lose this one. The Terazuki literally was trying to nudge up alongside her to stop her from sinking, but she's too large. Her crew abandoned ship at 3:25 as the Kirishima rolled over and sank. Likewise, the Anami sank after a chain of explosions occurred at 2 a.m. So we're seeing some big losses for the Japanese here.
Yeah, and I think I'll just add this because a lot of the damage done on the Kirishima was from Washington, right?
Yeah.
So Admiral Lee and the Washington, it was the last battleship to battleships, like a battleship being sunk by another equal in World War II by direct surface action.
Yeah. On the American side, we still have a few of these ships trying to survive the action. The very damaged Benham had been scuttled, and the Gwyn launched some Mark 15 torpedoes at her, which all exploded prematurely. One missed, one ran erratically in the wrong direction, and the fourth also missed. So again, it's very insulting. It's adding insult to injury here. Gwyn was forced to shell the Benham to death, which is embarrassing. Condo reached Truk, and he reported the sinking of the South Dakota class battleship that they had bought, two cruisers and 2 destroyers. But in reality, the Americans had just lost the Iwak, the Benham, and the Preston, while the Japanese had lost the Anami and the Kirishima. Almost 250 Japanese died, and about 242 Americans had died in this little battle. Henderson Field's bombardment was canceled, and it was a clear-cut victory actually for the Americans after everything is said and done, despite the absolute carnage in the first naval engagement. Lee proved himself an audacious commander, and Halsey had much praise for him. I would add, sometimes you say it's brave, sometimes you say it's stupidity. What Lee did was pretty insane. Like, it could have gone really bad. And if the Washington went down, that would, oh man, that would not have been good. Tanaka,
I mean, like, what forces do they have then?
Yeah. Of course, we still have to talk about poor Tanaka and all this. Tanaka continued for Tassafaronga as per orders from Admirals Yamamoto and Kondo. He beached the transports near the coast of Tassafaronga in order to unload even quicker. By 4 a.m., they ran aground along the coast near Tassafaronga, and they began the unloading process. By 4:30, Tanaka assembled his squadron to make their withdrawal back to Shortland, and at 5:55 a.m., the Cactus Air Force and the USS Enterprise began sending waves of aircraft to hit the landing site. Shore and sea artillery also aided the effort. 2 new 155mm guns and a pair of 5-inch guns fired upon the nearest 2 transports. The destroyer Meade, which was in the area, also aided to devastating effect. For about 42 minutes, Meade fired upon the transports with her 5-inch and 40mm batteries, and the combined attacks made the transports burning wrecks, destroying most of the ammunition and the provisions. In the end, both sides were trying to reinforce Guadalcanal. Admiral Turner managed to get 5,529 men with tons of supplies to Lunga, while Admiral Tanaka deposited only 2,000 with a pathetic amount of supplies, about 1,500 bags of rice, good for 4 days, and about 260 boxes of shells. Tanaka, in the end, lost 10 transports, which was egregious. The Imperial Japanese Navy could not spare any transports at this time. Overall, everything said and done, the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal saw the Americans lose 2 light cruisers, 7 destroyers, 1,732 men. The Japanese had lost 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, and 1,895 men. 26 American and 41 Japanese aircraft were also destroyed. Tanaka's failure to transport the men and supplies, and Henderson Field remaining intact because of bombardment, because technically missed, they just hit the other fighter strip that was being constructed at the time, was really bad. The Japanese military reluctantly reported, "It must be said that the success or failure in recapturing Guadalcanal Island and the vital naval battle related to it is the fork in the road which leads to the victory for them." So I just want to say to the audience, for those who have an understanding of the great naval battles of the Pacific War, a lot of people will point to Midway being the quote-unquote turning point. It's not, actually. The turning point, all encompassed, would really be the battle for Guadalcanal. as this is what changed the initiative. It actually put the Americans in the driver's seat, because even after Midway, despite the devastating losses, and of course they were devastating, the Japanese were still calling the shots. The Japanese were still being aggressive. But as we are seeing with the land battle on Guadalcanal and the naval battles such as this, the Japanese are losing that, and now they're going to have to be on the defensive footing. And that's something Admiral Yamamoto did not do well with. To be honest, after Midway, Admiral Yamamoto, he kind of collapsed upon himself. Always obsessed with the decisive battle that eluded him. Things didn't go good for him.
And I think that would also just cause the doom of the Japanese Navy, because it's still, even after his death, that would be the, something that they needed to focus on.
Oh yes, I mean, the biggest, obviously the one that people would look at the most is the Battle of Leyte Gulf. That was the last hurrah, trying to, get that decisive battle. And like my friend Ian says, if Leyte Gulf went in the opposite direction, it could have changed the entire course of the war still, because if they killed, if they had hit the transports with the men on them, it would have been a colossal loss of life. I don't know what the Americans would do under those circumstances, but yeah.
True. But, do have to admit one thing. This was also kind of like, two Japanese admirals were relieved of command, because in a way, Admiral Condo also was kind of disgraced by Yamamoto, for not winning, or whatever you want to call it. Because, ultimately, Admiral Lee's assertion of the situation was proper. He's delayed it long enough that they will not be able to get all their supplies through. They will not risk the bombardment. So he did his job and then pulled out, which, it's fine. He completed his objective successfully. And the thing is, unlike Admiral Abe, who was forced to resign, Kondo, they could not force him out.
That's true.
So one we see, because so for the audience, right? Kondo was very senior. I think in the hierarchy, actually, he was just behind Yamamoto.
Mm-hmm.
So, and because he was kind of also like the battleship general, or like, like in the US, it would be the black shoe versus the aviation admirals, right? Whereas, so they could not sack him for that. Whereas Abe, because he came from a destroyers group, they're like, oh yeah, he doesn't have prestige to his name, just sack him.
Yeah. But that encompasses, I think, it must have been more than 2 hours at this point. We've been talking about the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. It is a rather long one, and the notes I was using for this episode were very extensive. I apologize to the audience. It could have been summarized a little bit more, perhaps. And but do you have anything else to add to the comments?
I'm just glad we got to do this, because it's the tipping point.
Yeah, definitely
this is the tipping point, and it's still not talked about in that regards, which is not. I don't think that's fair to the significance of this battle. So I'm glad we got to shed some light about it.
People are enthralled by the surface engagements of World War II, but they fail to realize that a lot of the rationale for why there are surface engagements is to protect logistical lines. And this, again, was a battle of trying to supply Guadalcanal from both sides. One side was successfully getting their troops and supplies to the island, and the other side was continuously failing to do so, even though they were arguably winning some great naval victories. The Imperial Japanese Navy did have good victories, and they performed actually very well during all of this. But the Cactus Air Force coming out, Lee's little daring maneuver, which bought them enough time, they won the tactical victory here.
Yeah, but as you said, the U.S. landed almost 5,500 fresh troops, a lot of supplies, because now after this, supplies were not going to be too much of a problem for the United States forces on Guadalcanal. Whereas, if you see the rest of the campaign, what the Japanese have to go through, the supply shortage, it's crazy.
Oh yeah, it's tragic what happens to the Japanese forces stuck on that island, and it's called Starvation Island for a reason. But just before we head out, I guess I'll just reiterate to the audience that if you would like to further support me, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for what I will tackle next. I think we're starting at September, right? Just turned September the 2nd now. So I'll be putting out a poll pretty soon to see what will be the next episode. And honestly, I'm going to toss out a few options, but I hope some of the patrons come up with something unique. We're going to find out.
Well, I think I'm looking forward to the poll because I'm definitely going to be voting on that.
All right. And I do not want to put up another alternate history episode because that took up a lot of research time because I didn't want to bullshit people. Like, please, if anyone's interested, that episode on if Japan attacked the USSR, I think I did it justice because I ran the numbers as best as I could because a lot of people have a lot of misconceptions about what could have happened. And anyways, I won't tease any more of it. I think it's worthwhile to a lot of the audience members. But I'd like to thank you, Gaurav, for being a hostage in this 2-hour long podcast of me just like rambling and missing some sentences. I have to say I'm a little tired of my
no, no, but it's a learning experience for me, and I enjoy being on here. So no problems for me.
Until next time, I think we're going to be traveling back to North Africa, but we will be coming back at some point, I guess in 2 weeks' time, probably with another naval battle or. I don't want to give it away, but Gaurav has something he wants us to do. I won't say what it is, but it's kind of alternate
just keep
history.
It as a teaser.
Okay, all right. So until next time,
Yeah, right.
Pacific War Channel over now.
See ya.